One of the main leaders of the Westernization movement in Russia is Peter the Great of the Romanov dynasty. He is going to cement Russia as a Western country, a European country, an empire, rather than as an Asian country, an empire. Remember that Russia was smack dab in the middle of Europe and Asia. They could have gone either way. They had influence from the Mongols, they had influence from the Vikings. Peter the Great is going to lean Russia more towards the West as he tries to modernize Russia to get them caught up to the rest of Europe. Because remember, while the rest of Europe was going through their Renaissance, Russia was still under Mongol control. So he sees that they are behind, that they're archaic, and he wants to get them caught up to the rest of the modern world. You can even see that in this depiction of him, where he copies Western fashion, including the shaving off of his beard. He is going to get rid of beards in Russia. Y'all may remember Ivan IV had a very long, scraggly beard, and he had very thick clothing and coats because of the weather. Peter the Great is going to say, nah, we need to copy France. We need to copy Europe and become more like them to catch up with the modern world. He even bans beards and says that if you want to wear a beard, you're going to have to pay the government for the right to grow your own facial hair. He institutes something called a beard tax. And then if you show up to his court, there are barbers waiting outside his palace to shave your face before you go in and see him. And if you refuse and you show up in front of him with a beard, he was known to go into fits of rage and literally grab the beard with his bare hands and rip it off of their faces, like a waxing treatment, but incredibly painful and scary, because wearing a beard was seen as going against his absolute rule. He said, beards are no longer cool. We're doing the European thing, clean shaven with a little fancy mustache. So if you don't follow his rules, it's likely that he will punish you for that. So very autocratic, used to being an absolute ruler. Now, in absolutism, we know that the church plays a key role in legitimizing the rule of absolute monarchs. That's because absolutism is characterized by divine right theory, okay? But the church is also characterized by adhering to tradition. So where are they going to fall in terms of Westernization? Well, the church, the Russian Orthodox Church, is not going to be a big fan of Westernization, okay? They want to preserve traditional, oh, my pen's not working, traditional beliefs and values. Okay, they are going to be against Westernization. You have a lot of old believers in the church who promote Russian culture, traditional Russian culture. Okay, this is known as Slavophilism. Slav referring to the Slavic peoples, including the Russians. Phil referring to love. So this is love of traditional Russian culture. They don't want to change. They want continuities. Well, the Tsar wants change. The Tsar wants Westernization. And so he and the church are going to butt heads over the church wanting to remain traditional and the Tsar wanting to become modern. Okay? He's also going to want to rule absolutely. That's going to put him in conflict with the boyars. Remember, the boyars are the Russian nobles. They are concerned with getting and keeping power. Remember, there is a constant power struggle. This is a continuity. There's a constant power struggle between the nobles and absolute rulers, because the nobles want to increase their power and the absolute rulers want to increase their own power. So they're at odds with each other. So Peter the Great is going to be fighting the boyars over Westernization and power, and he's going to be fighting the church over Westernization and power. So he's going to undermine both of those groups in order to modernize Russia. One of the ways that he does this with the church is that he gets rid of the position of the patriarch. Y'all may remember that the patriarch is the leader of the Orthodox Church. They don't have a pope. They have a patriarch who is picked by the emperor or the czar. Well, when the patriarch dies, Peter the Great says, I'm not going to pick a new one. I'm going to get rid of the patriarch. And this is going to tick off the old believers because the patriarch typically supported traditional beliefs and values. So what is Peter the Great going to replace the patriarch with? He's going to replace them with the Holy Synod, which is a group, a committee of people handpicked by the czar to run the church. And so really the czar runs the church through the Holy Synod because the church becomes a branch of the government that he controls through this committee. And so he is going to increase his power at the expense of the church. He's also going to increase his power by changing the rules of who can join the church as a member of the clergy. He's going to say that if you want to become a monk in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you have to be at least 50 years old. He says before you can become a monk, during your youth, when you're young and strong, you should instead be a soldier. You should join the military. If you live long enough, then you can retire and join the church. Okay, so this is cutting off recruitment for the church and increasing recruitment for the military, which the czar controls, which is going to increase his own power. Okay, but the boyars also make up a large part of the military. So he has to try and decrease their power. He does this by instituting the table of ranks. Before the table of ranks, before Peter the Great, high-ranking members in the military got their high ranks not because they're good at their job, but because they were nobles, because they had a title, because their daddy knew somebody, because they had money that they could throw around. Now, does that make a very strong or effective military? No. If you just give people titles like major and colonel because they simply want the title and because they were born into a noble family, you're not going to be really great at fighting battles. And so in order to decrease the power that nobles have in the military and thus increase his own power, Peter the Great is going to institute the table of ranks. Instead of rising in position based on your social status or your money, instead, this is going to be a meritocracy, where you rise in position or are promoted based on your merits, based on your qualifications, based on how well you can do your job. This is similar to what we saw in China with the civil service exam. Instead of getting a position in the government because your parents are rich, instead you have to take a very difficult exam to make sure you know enough in order to run the government effectively. Okay, so he institutes a meritocracy in the military. This decreases the power of the boyars and increases the power of the czar. And this is going to be important because Peter is going to face a military coup that's led by boyars known as the Streltsy. So he is very keen to keep an eye on the military to make sure that the nobles can't overthrow him. And that's going to be our next topic of how Peter the Great rose to power in the first place. So Peter had to share his throne with his other siblings. His father had 2 wives, okay, and he had 3 children. Okay, so his father had 2 children from his first wife, a daughter and a son. And then he had Peter with his second wife. So Sophia, the daughter, and the brother from the first wife inherit the throne after Peter's dad dies. Now, Peter's older brother, his half-brother, wasn't all there. He wasn't very mentally competent. And so Sophia, his sister, is going to manipulate the brother. She's going to control the brother so that she can rule through him. Because as a woman in traditional Russia, okay, she didn't have a lot of power. So she uses her older brother to rule in his stead. Okay, so she's sharing power with the older brother. But then the older brother dies. Now it's Peter's time to rule. And Sophia can't control Peter the same way she controlled her full brother. Okay, and so she can't control her half brother, so she tries to get rid of her half brother. She gets nobles in the military, known as the Streltsy, to try to host a military coup to kill Peter the First. Now that coup is going to be unsuccessful. And so Peter is going to put his half sister in a convent as punishment. He doesn't kill her, but he puts her in a very boring prison. A convent is where nuns live. So it's just going to be a bunch of praying and Bible study. And so he takes her off the board, okay, so that she can't be a threat to him anymore. Then he is going to execute the Streltsy. He's going to kill the nobles that were a part of this military coup to keep him from power. Okay, so trying to control the boyars in order to increase his own power. And he is going to rule until 1725. During his rule, he is going to visit Europe, and he's going to spend a year touring around Europe and taking in all of the information and the modernization that they have to offer. Now, he goes in disguise, like he doesn't tell people, I'm the Tsar of Russia. He's just like, oh, I'm, Pedro from blah, 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 blah. But everyone knows it's him. The dude is 7 feet tall. So there's no disguise that's going to be able to fool people into thinking he's anything other than the Russian Tsar. But he goes touring around Europe, learning about shipyards and how to build ships, learning about dentistry, learning about different scientific branches, learning about, Enlightenment ideals. And he takes all this information back to Russia. And he tries to force it through Russia to get Russia caught up to the rest of Europe. Okay, and he's going to succeed in that westernization. But first, he has to take care of the threat to his power. He's gotten his sister off the board by placing her in a convent. What is he going to do with the Streltsy? He is going to execute them publicly and brutally. Okay, pikes on heads, beheadings, starvation. He's going to hang some of them up in metal cages in the wilderness to die in the elements, to die either of starvation, exhaustion, or hypothermia. And what's further, he's not going to take them down and bury them. He's going to leave them up in these cages all winter. And then when the spring comes and they thaw, the animals will eat them, and the bones and the meat and everything will rot out of the cages. The reason he does this is to send a message. This message is, if you try to overthrow me, you better succeed on the first try, or else this is going to be you. So this is a message to anybody who would try to overthrow him. Okay, I will return with brutal force to eliminate any and all of my enemies. Does that make sense so far? So with this policy of westernization, he is going to try to copy Western Europe as much as possible. That includes culturally, in terms of dress and appearance. He's going to change the fashion of Russia to mirror that of France in particular, because France is in the middle of its golden age under Louis XIV. Also by banning beards, with the exception of a beard tax. So if you pay the tax, you're allowed to grow your facial hair. But if you are presented to the Tsar, you better not have any facial hair other than a fashionable French mustache, or he will rip it out of your face. He broke church control by replacing the patriarch with the Holy Synod, thus making the church a part of the government, a branch of the government that he controlled. So he's increasing his own power, increasing his absolute rule by controlling the church to back up the divine right theory. He's also going to break noble power by promoting education establishing colleges so that nobles are not the only ones with access to education, by ending corruption in the military and instituting a meritocracy where you rise in status based on your qualifications and based on how well you do your job, rather than based on how much money or status you have. He also increases the number of soldiers Russia has by putting an age requirement on joining the church. You have to be an old man to join the church, 50 or older. If you're younger than 50, then you should be a soldier fighting for Russia. And he's going to use this new military, this bigger military, to conquer land in Europe, specifically from Sweden. When he conquers that land from Sweden, he's going to establish a new capital. He's going to move the capital of Russia from Moscow further west to St. Petersburg, which obviously he named after himself. This capital becomes his window to the West, increasing access to European modernization and ideas. It also gives him access to a warm water port on the Baltic Sea, which, remember, is a continuity in Russian history. They always want a warm water port because land trade is out. Okay, yes, Russia has access to the Silk Road and all this land trade, but maritime trade is what's popping. Well, you can't trade if your ships are all frozen in place in ice during the winter. So you need a warm water port if you're going to trade throughout the year. Okay, so in the Great Northern War, he is going to spend 20 years fighting Sweden so he can get this warm water port. In terms of women's rights, he's going to notice that women act differently in Europe compared to Russia. Remember, Russia was very conservative and traditional. Women could be forced into marriages. Women wore veils, okay, dating back to heritage from Mesopotamia and Asian influences. And women could not interact with men outside of their family. When Peter comes back from Europe and westernizes Russia, he's going to outlaw forced marriages. He's going to make women able to go in public without veils. And now women can interact with men outside of their family. Because when he goes to Versailles in France, he sees women dancing with men, playing cards with men, eating with men, talking with men outside their family. And remember, he wants Russia to be more like France in particular. And so he's going to bring those changes back. So women's rights are going to increase in Russia during this time. The population is also going to increase due to the Columbian Exchange, the arrival of potatoes. Okay, where did potatoes originate? Where'd they come from? The New World. Once they come from the New World, they're going to become very popular in Europe, leading to a population boom, including in Russia. Remember, potatoes could be buried underground to grow. So the cold winter of Russia doesn't affect potatoes as much. It means that there's more land that's suitable for farming due to this new crop. You also get the new manufactured good of vodka from the distillation of potatoes. And that's going to be a very popular alcoholic drink in Russia. So even the Columbian Exchange has a huge effect on Russia, even though Russia was not colonizing in the Columbian Exchange. Plus, a bigger population means more soldiers for your military, which is going to contribute to the expansion of Russia as it continues to grow in size. Are we good so far? Excellent. So here's a political cartoon depicting Peter the Great, Peter the First, cutting off the beards of his nobles. Okay, so if they're wearing a beard, then that indicates that they are a part of the old believers. Remember that the old believers rejected westernization. And so Peter the Great tried to force through westernization. tried to undermine the old believers in the traditional Russian Orthodox Church through the elimination of the patriarch position and the institution of the Holy Synod, bringing religion under his power, bringing the military under his power, so he could rule absolutely. Are we good so far? Remember that in building the military, he instituted the table of ranks, increasing people's position in the military based on how good they were at their job. So instead of getting a position based on who your daddy is or how much money you are as a noble, now you have to actually work for that higher status. The effect of this is that it's going to lower the power of the boyars and thus increase the power of the czar. Okay, there is a constant power struggle between these two groups, the nobles and absolute monarchs. I cannot emphasize that enough. So now, instead of a military that's focused on corruption and only fulfilling the basic necessities of your contract, now people are going to go above and beyond because there's a reward for going above and beyond and being good at your job. Similarity to Genghis Khan influence from the Mongols? Yes. Okay. Genghis Khan tightly controlled the military and how it was regimented in order to break up tribal ties so that the military would be loyal to him instead of loyal to their tribe. So yeah, you could see influence from the Mongols in this table of ranks, or you could compare it to the civil service exam in China, because instead of promoting people in the government based on who their parents were, in China, you had to pass this very difficult exam based on Confucianist thought in order to get those cushy jobs in the government, okay, making the scholar gentry higher in status than the nobility in China. Are we good so far? Now, even though Peter the Great does all of this cool stuff, he's not going to be perfect, right? Like the Ivans of the Rurik dynasty, like Ivan the Fourth, Ivan the Terrible, he is going to have a bad side and a big temper. He's very crude. He's very violent. Okay. He would rip the beards off of people's faces for disrespecting him. He would, if you mentioned to him, oh yeah, my tooth hurts, you know, blah, 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 he would sit you down, force your mouth open and pull the tooth out himself. Because remember, he studied dentistry in Europe. When he found out his wife was cheating on him, he killed her lover, put his head in a jar, pickled it, and put it on her nightstand table and forced her to look at it every night before she went to bed. Okay, so Peter the Great does not play. He will get you if you tick him off. That included his own son. His son disobeyed his wishes by marrying a woman that Peter didn't want him to marry. And so his son, Alexis, and his best friends and wife flee to Germany. They flee the country because they know that he's ticked off. Well, his son is supposed to be the next czar. That is not a good look for the government if the guy who's going to one day control the country flees the country. And so Peter the Great writes to his son and he's like, Alexis, come home. I promise I won't kill you. So Alexis was like, okay, I'm going to take that at face value. And he takes his best friends. He leaves his wife behind. He and his best friends who helped him escape go back to Russia to talk to his dad. Well, as soon as they land in Russia, Alexis is arrested and Peter kills all of his friends. He's like, well, if you look at the letter, I promise not to kill you. Didn't say anything about your friends who helped you commit treason. So Alexis is not very popular in Russia because he kind of, you know, dissed Russia by leaving it over some lady. Okay, and so there's a lot of public demand for his execution. Peter doesn't want to execute one of his sons, so he turns it over to the Holy Synod and says, hold a trial, and then whatever decision you have, I'll uphold. Well, the Holy Synod bows to public pressure and issues the guilty verdict with the punishment of execution. And so Peter the Great ends up accidentally killing his son through this execution for treason because he turned it over to the Holy Synod. He didn't stop the trial from taking place. Well, does this mean that the Romanov dynasty ends? No, because Peter has other sons. This was just his firstborn. It was his eldest son. Okay, so the Romanov dynasty continues. But even family members aren't safe from his wrath. Even though he's going to build up the military in Russia and make Russia bigger and make it modern, this isn't going to be awesome for everybody. Being a serf in Russia still sucks, especially since you're still doing forced labor. But now, in addition to agricultural forced labor, you're doing industrial forced labor, like the building of new shipyards for the new Russian Navy. Okay, so more work on the serfs. They're still forced to work. Also, the government needs more money to build these shipyards and Peter's new palace in St. Petersburg. And so they're going to increase taxes on the peasants and serfs, much like the French increased taxes on the Third Estate. Now remember, the peasants and serfs don't have a lot of money, but they're not a threat to the Tsar. Remember, his power struggles are with the boyars and the church. Those are what threaten him. He doesn't care about making the serfs happy. And since the serfs benefit the boyars, he's just going to leave them alone. He's going to continue serfdom in Russia. So some of those Enlightenment ideals, like life, liberty, and property, he doesn't bring back with him to Russia and institute, because that would undermine his absolute rule. Are we good so far? All right. So one of his biggest military campaigns is going to be fighting a Western European country. He's going to fight Sweden for 2 decades over a warm water port. Remember, I cannot emphasize the importance of a warm water port. He wants Russia to be more Western, so he takes some Western European land from Sweden. After 100,000 deaths and 20 years of fighting, Russia ends up winning in this great Northern War. So they get new territory in the Baltic Sea, they get a warm water port, and Peter decides that he wants a more Western capital. He moves the capital of Russia from Moscow, from the Kremlin, to the new capital, which he names after himself, St. Petersburg. And at St. Petersburg, he's going to build Peter Hulth, Peter's house, or the Winter Palace. And he's going to base it on the Palace of Versailles, because he had visited Versailles. He's also going to copy Louis XIV's policy of maintaining control over the nobles. Like Louis XIV, Peter I is going to have the boyars live at his Winter Palace with him throughout the year so he can keep an eye on them. He is copying France because France is the superpower in Europe at this time. Does that make sense so far? So looking at how Russia expanded. Here's Russia before the Great Northern War. Here's the territory that they gain after the Great Northern War, and that gives them direct access to the warm water Baltic Sea. So they become a major power in the Baltic. Then Peter moves the capital from Moscow, which, remember, the original capital had been in Kiev. Then it's moved to Moscow, which is considered the third Rome, because Rome fell in 476 and Constantinople fell in 1453. Now he's moving it as far west as it's ever been, to St. Petersburg, the window to the west, amplifying the European ties that Russia has, rather than emphasizing its ties to its Asian influences to the east. But they're not just going to expand west into Europe. He's also going to expand the Russian Empire east, more warm water ports over here. So Russia has become a very, very large land empire. It is a large land gunpowder empire. Okay, much like the Mughal dynasty in India, the Safavid in Iraq and Iran, and the Ottoman in the former Byzantine Empire are also gunpowder empires. It's just that the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman empires are Muslim. The Russian gunpowder empire is Christian. Are we good so far? So looking at that Winter Palace, he's basically going to copy what he saw in Versailles. Very elaborate decor, sculptures, fountains, everything's covered in gold and marble, very manicured gardens for everybody to entertain themselves at this palace. Paintings on the ceilings, expensive tiles, gold gilding everywhere. I guess if you have enough money, you just run out of things to buy. So you end up making fountain statues of a merman fighting an alligator. It's like, you do you, however you want to decorate your space. And so all of this is going to be copying what he sees in Europe. He wants to be an absolute ruler, like Louis XIV of France was an absolute ruler. And so he copies a lot of what he sees under the Bourbon dynasty. Okay, so what is the legacy of Peter the Great? Well, now Russia is a world power. They are caught up. They are powerful. They are a part of Europe. They have westernized and modernized to catch up with Europe. He has strengthened the military and weakened the nobles through the establishment of a military meritocracy. But not everything is going to be awesome under Peter the Great. Serfdom continues. That's a continuity. It becomes stronger. It becomes harder for the serfs. They're not only forced to work on farms, but they're also forced to work on shipyards, okay, industrialization for building up Russian maritime trade. They're still going to be taxed very heavily to fund this westernization. Okay, so serfdom is not going to end until we get to the modern period in 1861. So it's still very strong under the absolute rulers of the czars. Now, when Peter the Great dies, he leaves his throne to his second wife, Catherine I. He does have children that it passes down to, but first he leaves it to his wife. Okay, keep in mind, Peter I was married to Catherine I. This is different from what we're talking about tomorrow, where Peter III of Russia was married to Catherine II. Peter I is Peter the Great. Catherine II is Catherine the Great. Different Peters, different Catherines. It's critically important that you know the difference with the Roman numerals.